welcome back to Masters of the Air Debrief, Episode 9. Madison, we're at the end of the series.
It's a pretty good series, all in all.
I think we'll do one more episode on documentary they've just released. And then I know we have another interview or two that should be up now. But what a series.
Yeah, what a series. I'm a big fan of Band of Brothers. I haven't seen The Pacific, but now that we've finished this, I feel like I need to go back and watch that. Yeah, I was a little worried about the tone of the show, considering the moment in history that we're in and how glorification of war and violence in America it is. But they did a really good job.
Yeah, I feel like they wrapped it up in a way that says, we're so glad our boys got home. We're so glad they've gone and they've done this thing. But also, we're not rushing towards repeating it. We don't want anyone doing the same thing, obviously. And I think especially with those end cards, it just really sold the idea that some stayed career military men, so many others, we had teachers, mechanics, husbands and fathers, or just run-of-the-mill Americans that came back and just got to work, which was pretty inspiring.
Yeah. Moments from the episode, Rosie gets bombed down. He gets shot down. That's the opening scene, is Rosie getting shot down, which is the thing that we've just been dreading and hoping it just never happens, but it happens there at the end.
Yeah, he seemed, what's the air version of unsinkable? It just seemed like there was no way he could go down.
He was the master of the air.
He was the master of the air. I do love from a historical, technical perspective, and shout out to Ty Ramey. I know we tried to set up an interview. I don't know if we're going to have him on, but just the work of so many historians, including him, that we see the B-17s unpainted in this episode for the first time. And I went on a deep dive. I remember Memphis Belle or movies that have the bombers over Japan, and they're always silver. Why are these all green? And the long and short of it was, by this time in the war, by late 1944, early 1945, they didn't care about camouflaging the planes anymore. They just said, meh, we're already this far. Leave them raw and just go bomb. Just go on your missions. You have escorts now. They know we're coming. It's in the middle of the daytime. We're just going to go. No more painting.
Yeah, he in the opening dialogue while they're flying, he basically says, we were flying uncontested in the air. And the only thing was flak that they were catching. The Luftwaffe was no more. And so why camouflage your ships if no one's coming after you?
Yeah, that and then rockets. I had honestly forgotten until a few episodes ago when with Tuskegee Airmen there were rockets at this point, and I just imagine those as being a invention of a much later time, but had no recollection that's what they were facing. I do love that it opens on them over Berlin, and they're saying, should we bail? And Rosie's like, no, not yet. We are not going down in Berlin. You do not want to go down the last city that the Nazis are fighting to hold.
He doesn't want to go down in Berlin, and so the plane's dying, and they've been hit with rockets. So he's like, I'm going to try and get us beyond Russia's line so that we can go down in safety. Safety, in quotes.
Safety. Which at this point, the Americans and Russians in general were not mixing much. They weren't exactly running into each other, and there was still such a hatred of communism from the 1920s and pre-McCarthyism that you just didn't want to be caught with the Russians because you didn't know if it was going to be any better. Which is crazy to think that they were our allies, but it was an ally of necessity, not preference, because, yeah. That said, after watching this and Rosie goes down, he lands really hard, messed up. There's no way he's going to escape out of this foxhole he's in or anything else. It did make me realize I wish we had more movies from the Russian perspective during World War II. Because we have Enemy at the Gates and a couple others, but they lost so many people and they were battle hardened, and it was mostly peasant farmers with guns at that point of just not tons of training. Stalin was like, just keep going. Here, arm everybody and send them off. All of our gigantic country's people, go. But yeah.
You can definitely see the difference between the American soldiers and the German soldiers, and the Russians were not taking prisoners.
No.
They were just like going through, shooting everyone. Everyone's just dead. There's just no prisoners at all, which is scary because you're like, oh my gosh, how do they know that Rosie's on their side? And so he jumps up and he's like, I'm an American, Coca-Cola, the Yankees, I'm an American.
Hollywood. Yeah, we switch between Rosie and his getting, as I still call it, captured by the Russians, and then with them on their march to get him, he's trying to get to safety to get back to England. And then we have on the other side, Buck and Bucky and their crew being marched by the SS. Not a fun time. And for those who love hiking in the snow and the cold, good on you, but I hate it when I know I can get back to a car in a hotel. I can't imagine as a prisoner of war being marched into the heart of darkness as your own planes are strafing the marching lines and there's bombs going off and there's tanks. It's very difficult. They didn't exactly have GPS trackers and indicators of who's good or bad. If you were in this group, you were in danger of dying from your own people as much as you were the captors.
Yeah, I was really shocked when the plane flew in and just made a gun run on this line of people. Dude, you don't know who these people are.
Yeah.
You're going to kill your own guys. This is insane to me.
Which, we can't go too far into PTSD, but I'm wondering how it feels to have been a P-51 pilot or someone dropping bombs. And do you just never tell them they dropped them on your own people or your POWs? If someone somehow survived, where they're like, hey, why'd you just blast my whole group of prisoners? Interesting, at least, to think about, what that...
Yeah. You can definitely see in the march, though, they did a good job of showing that not only are the American POWs really worn thin, the Germans were worn really thin.
Yeah.
And like there's that moment where the German officer like sinks down to his knees, and then an American soldier comes and lifts him up.
Yeah.
And it's like, what's going on here? There's some solidarity building between these guys, or like some Stockholm syndrome. Like, what's happening?
Yeah, it felt like just an understanding of if the Germans didn't join and fight, they were going to get shot. So at this point, Hitler and Goebbels and the rest of them were conscripting kids and grandparents, which we'd seen children a little earlier when they crash landed in Germany or France, but that was as a citizen, as a child. This is in a uniform. It's really hard to watch at some points.
Yeah.
I know Jojo Rabbit has a more humorous take on this whole idea, but this here is much more intense of, you had grandfathers, you had men in their 60s and 70s who did not want to be holding a gun, ferrying troops or on the front lines, or there's that big troop wagon going by, and it's just almost all kids and grandparents, and it's just difficult to watch. And of course, we see later when Buck and two other airmen escape over a wall and have a showdown with these kids, and only to find out their weapons weren't loaded and they've got to kill one, or one weapon was loaded and he killed the other guy. Just
very traumatizing stuff. I think what was interesting was witnessing kind of the shift in power between the POWs and the German officers over the course of the episode, where they're all pretty worn thin, but then when Buck makes his escape, he makes it because Bucky starts fighting with some of the German officers, and they're like holding Bucky at gunpoint. And the American officer is like, he marches right up to the German in charge, and he's like, I demand that you let go, that you release my soldier. And then the guy just does it. And it's like, wait, who's in charge here now? And there are a number of points throughout this episode where you're like, why are the Americans not overrunning their captors? Because there's so many more of them than there are of the Germans at this point. And there's the energy of, oh, we're winning, versus the Germans have the energy of, oh, I would think we're losing this. And there are a couple of moments throughout the episode that finally in the end ultimately culminates in this of just like, why are they not like just revolting?
Yeah, it's difficult knowing how many people can die from a single gun or waiting for someone to reload. And there's definitely a catastrophic death toll there. As you're saying, though, we see it in Inglourious Bastards with Hans Landa, which is a funny scene, but true of towards the end of the war when they knew Hitler was toast and they knew what was going to happen when everyone finally beat them. I think a lot of Germans, maybe less so the SS, but a lot of German soldiers definitely were trying to be a little more graceful and a little more kind and hoping there was going to be some grace shown their way when everything swapped. Of either they're going to have to kill themselves or they were going to be at the Nuremberg trials. They were going to be really in a bad spot.
Yeah, this is a good point or a good time to circle back to Rosie, who's being brought back by the Russians, and they're traveling past concentration camps that are being burned down. And Rosie takes a walk through one of them. And this is a good contrast to the version of this scene that that happens in Band of Brothers.
Yeah.
Because in the Band of Brothers, they encounter a concentration camp and all the Jewish people are alive and they're emaciated. But in this one, they're all dead. And all the buildings are in the midst of being burned down. And it's just a smoldering ruin. And you just get a bunch of emaciated corpses. And Rosie's just walking through this and being like, what happened here? And the Russian officer comes up and says, we're finding these things all over the place. And these people were dead by the time we got here. And it's a really good POV into the horrors that were actually going on behind enemy lines.
And to me, it was one of those moments of, I wonder how often this was talked about. Because I know in our interview with Fred Bell from Palm Springs, the Air Museum, he mentioned when they had the airmen there, a lot of them didn't want to talk about war stories with everybody. And if they did, it was maybe 1, 2, 3 stories, and some of them had a funny outcome, or some of them had something heroic or horrific, but they weren't exactly sharing everything. And I think after seeing that part in the episode, it makes me realize that for a lot of these soldiers who were like Rosie were just passing through, or it was not their mission, it was just part of what they were seeing, how horrific it must have been and how little they probably talked about it.
Yeah. And then Rosie has that conversation with the last remaining German man from the village. And he's telling his story through a translator to Rosie. And he's like, I buried my children and my wife, and all I have left is this shovel. And Rosie's like, where are you going to go now? And the guy's like, what do you mean? Yeah. And he says to him that to live is to make choices. And I thought that was a really good, powerful line delivery that as a good theme for the show is that to live is to make choices. And all of our characters have been making choices with fraught consequences, but you have to,
Yeah, it honestly reminds me a lot of Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning, which is a great book. There's some things I don't fully agree with, or maybe some ways that we extrapolate on his research or ideas, but I do think it really hammers home what this German man was saying of those who think too much about it and get caught up in what's happening and the feelings, there's just no way to continue. You almost have to become robotic and shut things out. And I think that leads really well into Rosie getting back to England and meeting up with Crosby. And Crosby has this news of like, oh my gosh, his wife is pregnant. But there's this existential realization where he shares a quote from Nietzsche, which is, whoever fights monsters should take care not to become a monster himself. Because if you gaze into the abyss, gazes right back into you. And it feels like this is the entire show, obviously.
Yeah.
How do you fight the monsters and not become one? And every step of the way, you see this grappling of humanity versus vengeance and revenge and getting people what they deserve. And I like that kind of the pause of showing the quote and having Crosby be us as the audience and viewer and share that thought.
Yeah, because Crosby says before that, he says, all this killing that we do does something to a guy. And it just hangs there in the air. And you can really tell that just, wow, in order to win this thing, we had to really hurt our own people in order to win. But then Rosie's like, Cros, they were the monsters. Which is good for us to remember because we live in a world that's so much more nuanced, I feel like, than it was back in the day. And no, those were monstrous things. Like it was pretty clean cut. The German army was not the good guys here. And we just don't live in a world like that anymore. And so to be this conversation between Rosie and Crosby is a good way to lean into we got to be careful not to become monsters ourselves, but to remember, like, actually, these guys were already monsters.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, like you're saying, it's a lot more nuanced now. You and I grew up in a time where if anything was boycotted or just disparagingly talked about, it was either French people. Remember when they tried freedom fries?
Yeah.
After 9/11, we won't even talk about that shit show of intelligence nightmare afterwards of we're going to Iraq. Why? We don't know. Whatever. Where our parents grew up in a time where a lot of people, you did not buy a German car. You didn't buy a Mercedes, a Volkswagen, a BMW, because they were all making the planes, the tanks, the trains, everything used in the war. And on the same side, you also didn't buy a Japanese car. You had Japanese planes using Nissan or Toyota engines or Honda. It was just this, it was completely different, and it was still seeing everything so black and white. And I think it's interesting to see them play with that in this show and know that we don't face that in the same way. And so it can be difficult to grapple with. These were just German townsfolk, also German townsfolk who sent off their neighbors to be gassed. Okay, that's a very difficult thing in our head. And I like at least that it's a Rosie and Crosby discussion and not a Crosby and his commanding officer or someone much older. It's a peer to peer. We're both in this. This is how we're going to discuss it. I do appreciate that kind of twist.
Yeah. Slight tangent, but did you see the Volkswagen Super Bowl commercial last month? It was hilarious. It was like across sections in time. And the first one was like 1947, and it shows like the first Beetle. And then it like shows the Beetle evolving through time. And then you're like, wait a second. I think they missed some years there.
Just a few.
Like those were the seminal years of Volkswagen.
You know what? We're going to go on a history tangent for 2 minutes.
Yeah, do it.
It's always the game of, ask Porsche what they were doing in 1943. They were building a fantastic German tank. But anyways, but it was only years ago that I did more research on American corporations during World War II. And then it was ask General Motors what they were doing during World War II. Ask Goodrich or Goodyear Tires, or ask any of these American companies. I had no idea that when they would plan bombing runs, they would bomb everywhere but American factories, because every German car was using American wheels. All these parts. Yeah. GM was building motors for some of the Russian tanks. Like, just insanity. Ford was shipping motors and parts over to the Luftwaffe to build their planes before and during the war. And they're just things that I never understood that we've completely erased because we're like, doesn't fit the narrative.
Military industrial complex.
We may have been making hundreds of B-17s or P-51s in our car factories every day, which is amazing. But when you realize we were literally arming the enemy with tires, tanks, ball bearings, all of it, it just makes it feel a little frustrating to watch a show where we got to go bomb this ball bearing factory in the middle of Berlin early. No, nothing. Just we're going to lose all these people. And then realize, wait a sec, why don't we just stop selling tires to the Germans? Ugh. So.
Wow. Dude, that's disheartening. That's really disheartening because that stuff is going on actively right now.
Oh, of course. There's a reason that we watch Iron Man and we're like, yeah, what would Tony Stark be doing selling missiles to the bad guys? We're like, wait.
That's our foreign policy.
Yeah. Are we the bad guys?
That's a good segue into what I thought was my favorite part of the episode, which is where Buck and all the POWs arrive in this camp, and they're just sitting around waiting for something to happen. And then all of a sudden, a P-51 Mustang flies through the air and shoots up the watchtower and just emboldens all of the American troops. And they're like, hey, that's our guy. That's like our people. They're coming. And then it's the complete shift in tide of energy from, oh, the Germans are in charge, to, no, there's more of us than there are of them. We're going to start doing this now. And then they just take over the camp. And it's this really fantastic, beautiful scene where Bucky's going around the camp like, where's the flag? Where's the flag that we've made? And it's this really triumphant scene that's just beautifully staged and like directed, that results in Bucky climbing up the flag tower, tearing down the Nazi flag, and putting up some sewn together American flag. And I was watching that, and I was just like, I had a lump in my throat when I was watching it. I was just like, damn, this is so good. And I was just thinking in my head, I wish that I wish that there was a reason to be this patriotic anymore.
Yeah, and we're going to get political for a second. It was the moment I thought, I want to take the flag back. Yeah. It feels now almost like when I see people wearing too much American flag stuff, it feels more like seeing a Confederate flag.
Yeah, it does.
In a black neighborhood than it does like seeing our nation's flag and being proud of it. And again, symbolism aside, it's a tapestry. It's a symbol of what we are. But yeah, that scene with him putting the flag up on the pole, I was like, wait, America? I need some biscuits and pancakes and to talk to a veteran. It just was so inspiring shot. And it could have been a much more drawn out fight scene, battle, or whatever it was. I think they did a good job to, I think, keep it a little more close to reality. It would have been over in a few minutes. Punch, some shooting, okay, take them out. And then when the tanks are rolling in, it's that moment of, you guys saved us, but also we were good here too.
Yeah.
We took care of it.
I really liked how it was Bucky, because throughout their internment, Bucky was always the one who was like, hey, we got to go. We got to escape. We got to find our time to leave. And then when Buck is finally like, okay, let's do it tonight, Buck is the only one who's able to get away, leaving Bucky behind. And then to have Bucky be there all the way through to the end and be the one to lift the flag was really great storytelling, really great like character development in terms of like character arcs. It just was really well done.
I love, and it's so iconic, when the American colonel and the SS general meet.
Yeah.
And as part of war, it was very common that you always had a handshake during a surrender. But just knowing the atrocities and how everything had gone down, the colonel dismisses him. No handshake, just get out of here. And that was the moment of the SS is more evil than just a regular Nazi soldier. There's complicity and everything else throughout, but it was a proud moment of, there doesn't need to be respect when someone has shown none when it comes to war. This wasn't war, this was genocide on top of war. So, pretty powerful.
Yeah, I thought that scene in contrast to the scene where the POW American leader was like, you release my man.
Yeah.
Where it was like, oh, the Americans are actually in charge here. Like, they're just complying, to this scene where the American general just dismisses the Germans, and it's like, oh, we totally won. What a relief. What a good scene.
And I'm glad they didn't cut it right there. I liked the little ending scene of Buck says, hey, Cross, let's go feed some people. Showing that is what actually happened. I don't know if there's enough of a story there for a movie or whatever else to say like, oh, terrible name, but the candy bomber. We were dropping supplies into both sides of Germany because the Soviets weren't exactly bringing them groceries every week and being so kind. But yeah, oranges, chocolate bars, food, supplies, clothing, things like that. And it's just nice to see that little Buck and Rosie banter. Buck says, if you don't mind, I'll always take the left seat. And Rosie goes, I'll get the general on the phone. Just kidding. Just kidding. Which speaks to, I think maybe we've lost in the last few episodes because he was in a prisoner camp. But Buck must have been a hell of a pilot to have Rosie, who's outflown him by a long, shot down once and got back. But Rosie still makes a joke and says, yeah, you're still preferential. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I loved the way that they close this out, because it's almost like you had a little bit of a denouement of, oh, let's take a victory lap.
Yeah.
And I feel like the victory lap was these poor guys have been dropping bombs and killing people all during the war. And and the show is a testament to the toll that took on them. But then now that it's over, they get to drop life on people. They get to drop food and sustenance and stuff that like is going to make people's lives better. And like, you can see the relief and the transformation that like takes place on the characters' faces and in their interactions as they're doing that. And it's really, I think, was a fantastic way to draw their stories to an end.
And there's something nice in there. Crosby's back as navigator, back in a plane, as well as Kenny, who's one of the ground technicians, one of the ground crew, had never flown in a plane. He only worked on them. And he gets to sit in the rear turret seat and is just astonished seeing the whole scene flying into Holland where they're dropping the supplies off. It's really a beautiful, like you said, a beautiful way to tie it up of these men didn't see death and destruction and take part in it for a good cause and then continue it immediately afterwards. I guess some of them did in some ways with the other.
Some of them did, yeah.
A different story, but it's nice to see the story wrap up this way. And Crosby says, on occasion, the world must confront itself and answer what we are with who we are And he says, I was going home. I just wish more of us were. And it's that game of even when you've won, it's about the people you've lost. And it's so interpersonal that I just don't know that we're able to get through history a lot of times. And that's why I'm glad for shows like this to bring it to a more personal level where it's a character, but it puts you in the seat more than just behind a book or just reading something.
Yeah. Yeah. All in all, loved it. So good. Next, I want them to do the Tuskegee Airmen. That's the next show.
Tuskegee Airmen. I would love a show, just because my Norwegianness, I would love a show about the rebellions and retaliation in countries occupied by Germany. The Norwegians had a lot.
Yeah.
The Norwegians had a huge force, and a lot of my family was in that force that were in fighting against the Nazis. The Nazis were trying to get heavy water out of Norway, which was going to be used to make their atomic bomb. And
What's heavy water?
Oh, let's talk about heavy water. If I remember right, it just means it was easier to have a reaction. Heavy water was used as a primary coolant to transport heat generated by fission reactions to secondary water like coolant. In their version of trying to build a hydrogen bomb and trying to build an atomic bomb, they had to have this heavy water mined in Norway and brought it over for all their scientists. And so you had Norwegian liberation groups and militias who were sabotaging it every step of the way.
Wow.
There's a couple good French movies about it. I know I watched one a couple years ago, an indie flick about it. But I would love to have some more of those stories where, again, it's not just white Americans or white Brits.
Yeah.
I still want one about the Indian soldiers who joined, or the Moroccans for the French, or any of the other crews, because I think there are some great stories that I think will point to not only the humanity, but the toll and who was involved more than just the American foot soldier, which is like, I'm glad we had this series.
Yeah. Yeah. No, well done. Tom Hanks, Spielberg, if you're listening, so good. Have me onto your podcast and we can talk.
We'll get in your next room. We'll pick the next story. You're not already working on it. Thanks again for everyone who's tuned into the series. Again, we'll have one more episode about the documentary that's coming out on Apple TV Plus, as well as a couple other interviews. I know that we will have had Rebecca Hutchinson on, who was Harry Crosby's youngest daughter. We had Fred Bell, who's the vice chairman of the Palm Springs Air Museum, as well as Matt Mabe, who is the part of the 100th Bomb Group Foundation and worked very closely with the production of the show. So we hope you enjoy it and enjoy the last episode.